The Hebrew Notion of Divinity, a podcast by Dr. Arpaia. As a point of information, I want to be sure that you understand when I talk about a Hebrew notion of divinity, I mean how the ancient Hebrews conceived of their God. By taking this approach, I do not mean to suggest that the Hebrew God did or does not exist. Rather, I am limited by a historical approach. One can neither prove or disprove the existence of God historically, but one can study how people conceived of a God and the implications of their belief. And that's what we will do. I have 4 expectations as you watch and listen to this podcast. First, I want you to be sure you understand our scientific definition of antisemitism. Second, I want you to recognize 5 basic differences between the Hebrews' notion of divinity and those of their neighbors in the ancient Mediterranean. Third, I expect you to understand how the Hebrew notion of divinity created a unique way of life for the Jews and shaped their history as a people. And fourth, I want you to understand how the Hebrew notion of divinity structured a Jewish sense of identity as individuals and as a group. Throughout the podcast, then, I will give examples of parallels in later societies belonging to the Abrahamic tradition, as they adapted and adopted Hebrew notions of divinity. We will return to this subject later in the course as we examine attitudes towards Jews in these societies. For now, I want you to know these few examples that I give you. If you come from a country that developed in the Abrahamic tradition, such as the United States, you might also think about other parallels on your own. So let's begin by reviewing our working definition of antisemitism. We have devised a scientific definition for antisemitism. By scientific, we mean that we have a verifiable definition. That is, the criteria make sense, and anyone examining the same evidence will conclude that either a society or person is anti-Semitic or not. In the first podcast, I explained that our working definition has 4 core elements. All 4 must be present in a case study for us to conclude that we have found an example of antisemitism. If 1, 2, or 3 elements are present, the example falls short of antisemitism. If no core elements are present, the example is completely different from antisemitism. Remember, too, that we're not just looking for isolated cases of the core elements, but rather for evidence of systemic antisemitism. Systemic means that the something is not limited, sporadic, or insignificant. It is pervasive, persistent, and inescapable. Systemic antisemitism is infused in social, political, economic, and cultural institutions, and in a society's very way of life. Systemic antisemitism is pervasive, persistent, and inescapable because it governs how people live their lives, and because an anti-Semitic society teaches members that antisemitism is acceptable and normal and will always be that way. So, if one lives in a society in which antisemitism is systemic, it does not matter if you are anti-Semitic or not. Antisemitism still exists because the game, so to speak, is fixed so that Jews can never belong. The first core element of antisemitism is an anti-Semitic Weltanschauung, by which we mean a worldview in which the Jews, all Jews, and Jewishness play a fundamental role in the perception of humanity. Our model allows the core terms Jew and Jewishness to be changeful. The presence of the first core element gives antisemitism its systemic quality. If a social group does not view Jews and Jewishness as playing a central and harmful role in human history, the group's attitudes towards Jews and Jewishness will not pervade the whole social group's way of life and its institutions. Similarly, if an individual does not view Jews and Jewishness as playing a central and harmful role in human history, the individual's attitudes towards Jews and Jewishness will not become an individual's fixation. The second core element is reliance on negative stereotypes about Jews that juxtaposes them and non-Jews as intrinsically different. The third core element follows from the second, a specific way of thinking about Jews that negates their individuality. Anti-Semites have a specific way of thinking about Jews that denies their humanity. The final core element is reliance on mythopoeia to define Jews and Jewishness. If you do not understand these core elements, please go back to the first podcast and review them. Next, let's consider the Hebrews and the Jews with regard to how they differed from their neighbors in the Eastern Mediterranean with regard to their notion of divinity. Let's recall that the Hebrews were monotheistic. They believed in a single divinity that was totally in control of reality, whereas their neighbors were polytheistic. They believed in many divinities, with each god or goddess in control of one or more aspect of reality. The Hebrew divinity was a lawgiver. The Hebrews' God taught them what was right and wrong, both on the individual and collective levels. It expected each and every one of them to do good and to avoid evil. For their neighbors, law may have been considered to come from one or more of their divinities, but it was the ruler, sometimes considered a divinity, as with the Egyptians, whose words were law. The Hebrews believed that their one true God chose them as the one group of people with which to have a unique relationship. It chose them from all the other people in the world to be its chosen people. In their neighbors' religions, the notion of divinity was more or less the converse. The people chose to follow certain gods, usually because the gods did things for the elites or the society as a whole. The Hebrews believed in an immaterial God. It had no substance. Indeed, the Hebrews believed it was impossible to say or write their divinity's name, lest they gave it materiality. The Hebrews, and later most Jews, would still not write or say the name of their God. Let me interject a point of clarification. In this course, I will use the gender-neutral pronoun it to refer to all gods, including the Hebrew notion of divinity, because it was neither male or female. Of course, from a Hebrew theological perspective, using the pronoun it is also incorrect, since the divinity had neither gender nor form. The Hebrews' neighbors had a very different conception of divinity. Their gods had substance. They could take the form of people, places, or things. Some had male and female gods. Others had gods with a combination of human and animal bodies. Some had gods that could die and be reborn either in a hereafter or in the here and now. As one might expect from an immaterial god, the Hebrew divinity could not be sated by human actions, favors, or sacrifices. Their neighbors' gods, instead, could, and many of their neighbors' rituals involved sating their gods to obtain favors from them. Next, let's explore the Hebrew notion of divinity by concentrating on these 5 aspects that differentiated them from their neighbors, so that we can understand them better and the significance of their notion of divinity. Because the Hebrews believed that there was only one true God, they logically considered their neighbors' gods to be fake, and they did not keep quiet about their views either. As you might imagine, assertions of this kind did not sit well with their neighbors. In the ancient world, one test of strength for a people's gods was the people's success in warfare. The thinking went something like this: if a people's gods did not give them a victory, they must have done something to displease their gods. If the army lost the whole war, often putting the tribe, kingdom, or empire at risk of annihilation, there could be no doubt about the superiority of their enemies' gods, or even about the falsity of their own. And yet, even in defeat, the Hebrews were intransigent. That means unwilling to change their views. Not even utter defeat at the hands of their enemies changed their conviction that their divinity was real and that their enemies' gods were false. We know from historical records that this attitude puzzled their neighbors. Of course, some Hebrews did give up on their God and were absorbed by their neighbors and thus lost their identity as Hebrews. But, on the whole, enough Hebrews took defeat in war as evidence that they had failed their God and not the other way around, so that the Hebrews never disappeared. We said that the Hebrew God was a lawgiver, so let's take a look at the ramifications of defining divinity in this way. The Hebrews believed that their laws were given to them directly by their divinity, and Hebrew religious texts spelled out in exacting detail every single aspect of living one's life as the chosen people. Scholars call this form of religion ethical monotheism. Monotheism because the Hebrews believed in one God. Ethics because divine law constituted shared moral principles that govern their collective behavior. Let me explain further that morals are standards of behavior or beliefs about what is and is not acceptable. For the Hebrews, their divinity dictated both morality for individuals and ethics for the family and the whole community through the God's Word. Historically, their God's Word came to them first through oral traditions and then in written form in the Hebrew Bible. You might imagine that a religious system based on ethical monotheism would require a lot of laws, and in fact, Hebrew laws govern just about every possible human activity from the cradle to the grave. By most reckonings, the Hebrew God gave the chosen people over 600 laws to follow exactly as spelled out in the Bible. The system of rules and regulations were eventually attributed to the mythical leader Moses. Scholars thus refer to this set of 600-plus rules as the Law of Moses, or as Mosaic Law. The two terms are interchangeable. If we take as a point of comparison, say, Buddhism, another ethical belief system, it has about 200 precepts. Judaism contains more than 3 times that number. As you might expect, over time, the Hebrews encountered situations or discovered phenomena that were not spelled out in the laws contained in the Bible. So the Hebrews had to extrapolate more and more. In other words, they needed to figure out how to incorporate new situations and phenomena into their existing moral and ethical framework. This need to extend the application of a method or a conclusion from a known situation to an unknown situation required what we call today critical thinking. As we shall see, thousands of years later, this religious imperative to learn how to think critically played a central role for Jews practicing their faith in a modern industrial world that was very different from the one in which Judaism first developed. Because right and wrong were dictated by a God that stood supreme outside of human reality, the Hebrews believed that no one was above the law, no matter one's station in life. Everyone had to follow the law. This notion is called the supremacy of law. And it is a fundamental aspect of modern states today, which most of us do not recognize as an idea that originated, at least in the West, from the Hebrew conception of their God as a lawgiver. The supremacy of law encouraged the development of a prophetic tradition in Hebrew society. The Hebrews believed that prophets were people whom their God had chosen to serve as a conduit between the chosen people and their divinity. They were sent, in particular, to call Hebrew society to account for violations of divine law. When the Israelites developed a monarchy around 1000 BCE, the Israelite and later Jewish monarchs were required to obey the law because the Hebrews believed that it came from their God, thus creating the very real possibility for clashes between prophets and kings. This tension is reflected today in the tension between church and state in modern states like our own. let me point to a third consequence of the Hebrew notion of the divine origin of law. So long as a Hebrew, Israelite, or Jewish society existed, the chosen people could structure their public and private life according to their own laws. But if they lived in a non-Hebrew society, the possibility for conflicts between the Hebrew and non-Hebrew way of life presented itself, thus forcing the chosen people to choose between their God's laws and the laws of other gods. One way to resolve this conundrum in Hebrew history was how the one true God supposedly gave the Israelites a land for their own, where they could set up their own society according to their God's commandments. The Hebrew notion that their God chose them as its chosen people, instead of the other way around, legitimized in their ideas that they, and their descendants, had a right to a geographical area that Gentiles would not necessarily recognize as a land promised to the Jews by their supposed divinity. This logic has had a great appeal to us Americans. For instance, in the 19th century, Americans justified their genocide of native populations and a series of aggressive wars against their neighbors because the North American continent was supposedly their promised land. For Jews, being their God's chosen people among all the peoples of the world came with enormous responsibility. The Hebrews believed that their sole function in life as individuals and as a community was to follow their God's laws. Nothing else mattered. Success in life was not supposed to be measured in any other way. What mattered was whether the promised people lived their lives according to divine will, as individuals and as a collectivity, through a total obedience to the Hebrew divinity. Furthermore, human history was the story of their God's relationship with them and their relationship with their divinity. And yet, although the Hebrew Bible purports to be a historical account of the one true God's creation of a world with man at its center, from the myth of Abraham onward, the Bible only recounts the relationship between the God and its chosen people. No one else seemingly counted except as a foil. This view of mankind left out most humans as unworthy of history. Gentiles were of no interest to the fate of humankind unless they contributed positively or negatively to the history of the chosen people. This prejudicial view that history belongs to some, but not all, characterized the way history has been done in societies, like our own, that derive from the Abrahamic tradition. A struggle against this prejudice began in the 20th century and continues today among scholars and activists who insist that their kind are worthy of history too. The Hebrew conception of history is quite remarkable in another way. Unlike their neighbors, the Hebrews had a linear conception of history. It had a beginning, a middle, and an end. History began when the Hebrew divinity supposedly created the universe. Next, it manifested itself to humankind, selecting a tribe as its chosen people among all the people of the earth. And, eventually, the world would end in a cataclysm. This notion that human history would end in some type of worldwide climax is called eschatology. In Hebrew eschatology, history would end for everyone and everything. Again, this conception of history is shared by Jews, Christians, and Muslims today, and by many atheists as well. The Hebrews also believed that their God was in charge of human history, not just the history of its chosen people, but all people. This aspect in the Hebrew conception of God and history meant that everything that happened had a purpose that was knowable only to the divinity. History was God's will. The idea of a divine purpose in history can be found in all societies belonging to the Abrahamic traditions, and among modern societies that no longer see history as divine will, but rather the determination of some other imagined historical guiding force. The Hebrew notion of divinity was of an immaterial God. Because the Hebrew God had no substance, the Hebrews believed it did not conform to time and space, which limited our world. The Hebrew God existed on a different plane from humans. And if God was not part of the world, it was ultimately unknowable. It remained a mystery to humans because it was discernible neither through the senses nor the intellect. Although the Hebrews were sure that the world would end someday, their God remained eternal. The Hebrew God was, is, and always will be. Moreover, because the Hebrew God was another God that existed on another plane, it could direct our history. Or, put another way, what happened in the world was the Hebrew God's will. Now, without getting all philosophical on you, I'd like to point out that the belief in an immaterial divinity, who supposedly ruled over a material world but was not part of it, raised a conundrum. How could an immaterial God act in a material world and still remain immaterial? Wouldn't the God need to become material to operate in the universe? The answer for the Hebrews was that their God acted indirectly in the material universe through agents of its choosing. The Hebrews believed that they, the chosen people, were the primary agents of their God. It was through them that their divinity's will was done. But the Hebrews also believed that their divinity acted through non-believers too. The Hebrews believed that Gentiles could have a purpose in their God's divine plan for the human race. For instance, the Hebrews believed that their God might act through Gentiles to punish the Hebrews for not remaining faithful to their God at a given time and place. Similarly, their divinity might use nature to intervene in the material world. Indeed, Hebrew myth is replete with accounts of indirect divine action, as in the case of Noah and the flood that wiped out mankind except for those who supposedly took refuge in Noah's Ark, along with 2 of every species of animals. The immaterial of the Hebrew God raised another conundrum for its believers. How can you depict a divinity that has no materiality? What do you call it? If you give it a name, doesn't it gain materiality? The Hebrew solution was not to give their God a name. Instead, it was referred to by the 4 consonants Y, H, W, H, from which the word Yahweh was derived. But because the consonants did not constitute a word, it was not a name for the Hebrew God. Still, no one was supposed to write these letters or try to vocalize them. Even today, members of the Orthodox and conservative sects of Judaism will still not write or say that word in any language, using instead abbreviations if they need to refer to it. Let's consider the final attribute we listed for the Hebrew God. It could not be sated or satisfied. If Yahweh could not be sated, it could not be controlled. It had no needs, and thus the Hebrew God could not be controlled by humans or by any force for that matter. Nor could Yahweh be manipulated. It could not be made to do anything. God's will was beyond the scope of human influence. Because the Hebrew divinity did not need anything to satisfy itself, it was omnipotent, which means all-powerful. So one might ask, why did the Hebrews eventually build a single temple in the city of Jerusalem? And why, for as long as the followers of Yahweh controlled the city, did the Hebrews sacrifice animals and crops to their God there? Sacrifices of animals and crops signified a belief that everything the followers of Yahweh received was a gift from their divinity. The sacrifices were not means of gratifying the deity, nor were they attempts at attaining favors from it. According to Hebrew myth, Yahweh ordered them to build only one temple. If followers could not get to the temple, they could sacrifice foodstuffs to Yahweh in prayer halls in the towns and cities where they lived. According to Hebrew myth, their God gave them detailed instructions on the construction of the temple, on the qualifications to become a priest, on the functions of the Jewish priesthood, on the rites for carrying out temple sacrifices, on what could be sacrificed, and on how sacrifices were to be performed. The most restricted part of the temple was called the Holy of Holies. It was an empty room where their God supposedly manifested itself at the end of one year and the beginning of the next, and where only the high priest was allowed to enter and intone the name of Yahweh as he asked the Hebrew divinity to forgive the sins its chosen people had committed over the years. But this most restricted area of the temple grounds was empty. Unlike the temples of their neighbors, the Holy of Holies did not have a representation of the Hebrew divinity. The Hebrew notion of divinity was pretty much impossible for their neighbors to comprehend. To give you an idea why, let's consider some of the divinities belonging to the Hebrews' contemporaries. Unlike the Hebrews, their neighbors' gods governed specific aspects of life. For instance, before Greeks would set on a voyage, they would make a sacrifice at one of the many temples to Poseidon, the god of the sea, in the hope that the sea god would give them a successful journey. At times of danger, the ancient Roman state would sacrifice precious objects, animals, or crops to the head god Jupiter, who was thought to be the protector of Rome. And the Canaanites made human sacrifices to their fertility god Baal in the hope of good harvests. Given Gentile notions of divinity, it is not surprising that the Gentiles who encountered Jews thought the Jews were very weird. Let's finish by considering the fourth expectation. The Hebrew concept of identity was a logical consequence of their ethical monotheism that required them to live a unique way of life, both as individuals and as a group. And lest we forget, this way of creating an individual and group identity was adapted and adopted by the Israelites and the Jews, and later by the followers of Jesus and Christians, and later still by Muhammad and the Muslims. Let's take a closer look at how Hebrews, Jews, Christians, and Muslims formed identities as individuals and as a group through their belief in a one universal God of Abraham who was a lawgiver. Myths and laws constituted the foundation for identity formation among individuals and societies in the Abrahamic tradition. Whether we're talking about the Hebrews or the Jews, Christians or Muslims, all of the myths began as oral traditions that were subsequently compiled and edited in written form. Both narratives that purported to convey a universal truth and laws needed to be interpreted. In the case of myths, the reader had to interpret the narratives, looking beyond the words in the story for meanings about good and evil that could then be applied to one's life. Laws, too, had to be interpreted. But if anyone could interpret the myths and laws, who ensured a correct interpretation? On the one hand, ensuring a correct interpretation of the myths and laws was done at the individual level by single members of society. On the other, religious authorities of one sort or another also had a say over what was or was not a correct interpretation. Ultimately, a society would have the final say about whose interpretation was valid. This tension among individuals and between individuals and society gave Hebrew identity formation an intrinsically contested nature. Members of the chosen people could and would disagree over what it meant to be a Hebrew, an Israelite, or a Jew, and later also what it meant to be a Christian or a Muslim. This social practice of identity formation and the policing of it in the Abrahamic tradition made one's life a constant act of trying to follow correctly the God of Abraham's instructions on how to live one's life as an individual and as a collectivity. This emphasis on obedience to God's law is why we use the verb to practice to signify what it meant to be a Hebrew, an Israelite, a Jew, a Christian, or a Muslim. In the Abrahamic tradition, belief, correct action, and identity were all connected. One recognized someone's identity in the Abrahamic tradition by the way the person lived his or her life. The ritual circumcision of Hebrew and Jewish males piqued the curiosity and even the repulsion of Gentiles. For instance, in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, a collection of Egyptian writings on burial practices that dates back to approximately 1500 BCE, mentions the Jewish practice of circumcision, calling it self-mutilation. Keeping the Sabbath was another practice that set the Jews apart. You have to remember that in most societies in the ancient world, only a small group of elites were able to refrain from work. Everyone else had to work every day, or else one had a limited number of religious festivities when one might not work. The Jews instead did not work one day out of 7. The Sabbath was meant to commemorate and to reflect on the Hebrew divinity's creation of the world. Every 7th day was called the Sabbath in the Jewish lunar calendar. The Sabbath lasted from sundown to sundown. During this 24-hour period, Jews did not work so they could celebrate the love of their God for them. Instead, they prepared food and did chores on the day before the Sabbath so they could spend their time reading, praying, and singing. The disappearance of Jews from the fields, from their shops, and their retirement to their homes and places of worship led many Gentiles to assume that Jews were just lazy people. Who else took so many vacation days? Cleanliness was another aspect of Jewish daily life that made them visible. For instance, Jews believed that they had to eat a clean diet, according to the instructions in their sacred texts. They called this practice keeping kosher. Animals for food had to be slaughtered and cleaned, and the meat handled according to exact instructions in the Bible. Their God would not let them eat any other foods. For instance, Hebrews, Israelites, and Jews believed that their God prohibited them from eating any mammal that did not chew its cud or have split hooves. Their divinity also forbade them from eating birds of prey. They could not cook meat and milk together, nor could they even eat the one while the other was still being digested in the stomach. We find contemporaries did not accept these practices. For instance, Gentiles found it strange that Jews were reticent to eat with them. The God of Abraham instructed Jews not to touch or otherwise come into physical contact with Gentiles. Again, we find evidence of non-Jews who found this practice strange and even insulting. Additionally, the God of Abraham would not let them come into contact with non-kosher animals or to touch any dead animals, unless they were butchering or preparing them for consumption. Jews believed their divinity wanted them to keep clean, which meant ritual bathing, before praying and eating, as outward signs of cleansing themselves of their sins. This emphasis on ablution or washing set them apart from non-Jews. Like peoples of other faiths, Jews also had special clothing that distinguished them as Jews. Moreover, their daily life set them apart from their neighbors. Jews began their day at sundown. They prayed at least 3 times a day, morning, noon, and night. They tried to carry out an act of charity every day. Let me end my discussion of how belief in the God of Abraham made Jews visibly different from their Gentile neighbors by pointing to some unique Jewish burial practices. Their divinity prevented them from cremating or embalming the dead. The Jews considered these practices, found among their neighbors, to be acts of defilement of the body. When a Jew died, the body was washed according to the instructions in the Bible. The body was wrapped in a shroud and placed in the ground without any other container. Burial could only take place on property belonging to another Jew that was specifically set aside for the purpose of Jewish burial. Except for deaths on the day before the day of the Sabbath or a Jewish festival, their divinity instructed them to bury their dead before sundown of the day following the death. These daily practices made Jews and later on other communities in the Abrahamic tradition visibly different to others and set them apart from their neighbors. Their daily practices were a constant reminder that Jews and other members of the Abrahamic tradition were different. The prophetic tradition among the Hebrews was another important aspect of their unique belief system. You will recall that I already pointed out that prophets played an essential role in the Jewish sense of identity by assuring that the community remained true to the way of life the chosen people were supposed to follow. The prophetic tradition continued to play a vital role in preserving the identity of the different religious communities belonging to the Abrahamic tradition. Both Christians and Muslims justified the righteousness of their religious beliefs and ways of life by appealing to this prophetic tradition, whether it be Jesus or Muhammad. For the Jews, having a Jewish mother became an essential requirement, along with practicing Judaism, of course, for someone to claim identity as a Jew. Conversion to Judaism was possible, but neither the Hebrews nor the Jews proselytized, a practice one finds instead in Christianity and Islam. Still, Jewish conversion was permissible, and the Bible prescribed rituals for the process, which included circumcision for male converts. A territorial component was added to the concept of identity among the followers of Yahweh with the development of the concept of a promised land. Around 1000 BCE, the Israelites conquered the land of Canaan because they believed that their divinity wanted them to take it away from the Canaanites, who worshiped false divinities, and to make it their own. Soon after the establishment of Jewish communities in the newly conquered so-called Promised Land, the Israelites established a monarchy. For approximately the next 1,000 years, the Israelites and Jews' loyalty to the occupants, or claimants, to the throne of the land of Israel became an important part in Israelite and Jewish senses of identity. The notion that the God of Abraham gave a fixed place on earth specifically for the chosen people to carry out its will introduced a new aspect to Israelite and Jewish identity. To what extent was possession of the Promised Land integral to identity as the chosen people? Human history, which, you will recall, the Hebrews considered the will of their God, provided an ambiguous answer. If human history demonstrated that possession of the Promised Land did give Jews a unique opportunity to create structures in the form of a Jewish state and a Jewish society that could create, police, and defend their identity as Jews, history also demonstrated that residing in the Promised Land was no guarantee against Jews losing their faith and thus their identity. Furthermore, history provided examples of Jews retaining their identity during periods of exile. So, possessing the Promised Land was not essential to one's identity as an Israelite or Jew. Instead, belief in a Promised Land was. One could and did remain Israel or Jew even if one did not live in the so-called Promised Land. We can summarize by saying that the essential core of Jewish identity consisted in three elements: their myths and Mosaic law, as well as interpretations or commentaries on them; the distinct lifestyle by which Jews put into practice their acceptance of the covenant with the God of Abraham; and the prophetic tradition, which, in a more general sense, included the ability of devout Jews, and not only official prophets, to understand the meanings of their myths, laws, commentaries, and human history, and thus ensure their Jewish identity. But what about the monarchy? According to the second book of Samuel in the Bible, the desire for a king came from the Israelites. The one true God tried to dissuade them from creating a monarchy by warning them that they would not like their king, because kings were corrupt and forced their people to do things they did not want to do. But the Israelites insisted they wanted a king because all their neighbors had one. So, out of love, the God of Abraham gave in to their wishes and chose Saul, a military leader. He then had the prophet Samuel anoint Saul with holy oil as the first king of Israel. The myth of Saul had an important impact on both Christians and Muslims. Hebrew kingship played a vital role in justifying first the divine origin of kingship among Christians and Muslims, and later, when Christian and Muslim monarchies were no longer fashionable, the divine origin of the state. Indeed, despite the American Constitution's separation of the church and state, Americans have accepted the idea that our government was and is ordained by a Christian God, if one is religious, or by providence, progress, or other non-religious imperatives, if one is atheistic. As we shall see in this course, the notions of the church and state as two competing powers, the heritage of the Israelite and Jewish myth of Saul, would have important consequences on the creation and development of antisemitism from the 4th century to the present day. But that's the topic of another podcast.